Welcome. Welcome to 9 wonderful, slightly wicked secrets for writing a killer thriller or mystery with Kate White. My name is Penn McNerney. I'll be your host tonight. So we have with us tonight the New York Times bestselling author Kate White. She'll be sharing secrets she's learned writing 18 suspense novels, including her latest, The Last Time She Saw Him, along with a few tricks she says she's plucked from the brains of her best-selling author pals. Kate is the former editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan, and she is the New York Times bestselling author of Between Two Strangers and 8 other standalone psychological thrillers, as well as 8 Bailey Wiggins mysteries, including Such a Perfect Life, which was nominated for the International Thrillers Writers Award. After our talk, Kate will be signing books, and we ask that you purchase them first before having them signed. So it's happened, believe me.
I've seen it.
Oh, wow. So we're so happy to see all of you here tonight. And Kate White, thank you.
So pleased to see all of you. I suggested this idea to Julie as something a little bit different. And I wrote her last week and I said, if we don't get any takers, I'll understand. And we just won't do it. So I'm so pleased. This is great. I thought I'd start with just telling you a little bit about myself, because I think there's something a little inspiring to my own story as a mystery writer. And then I'll jump into I actually came up with 10 strategies. And then I'd be glad to take questions because I'm sure you have some. Okay, first I should ask, how many former Nancy Drew or current Nancy Drew readers do we have? When I was growing up, I wanted to be a writer from the time I was like 7 years old. And I tried poetry, I tried short stories, I put out a little magazine in my high school, I wrote a play that was put on my high school. But as a Nancy Drew fanatic, I really wanted to one day write a suspense novel, a novel about a female private eye. Right? Didn't we all want to do that? When we realized we weren't brave enough to be Nancy, we thought, well, I'll just become a writer and write that kind of book. And when I was in college, I realized that I kind of had to pick a lane about what kind of writing I was going to do. And I won a contest that Glamour magazine had called the Top 10 College Women Contest, which was a fantastic contest. We just had our 50th anniversary, my group, and I met my husband 10 years later from one of the winners. She was anchoring the news with him. So it was great. But because of winning that contest, I decided the lane I was going to pursue was magazines. And I moved up in magazines, and eventually I became the editor-in-chief of Redbook. And it was a plum job. I got to give a luncheon with Mrs. Clinton once in the White House, but I really began to feel I wanted to go back to and explore the idea of that old lane of writing a mystery, because I thought at this point, I was in my 40s. I thought, if I don't do it, it's never going to happen. And I thought, I want to do that before I die. So I thought about it, and I thought maybe if I wrote a little bit every morning before I took my kids to school, because there was no way I could quit my job. And maybe if instead of writing about a female private detective, I changed the character to a magazine true crime writer. So that way I wouldn't have to do as much research. Yeah. Which I did not have time for. I got about 4 chapters done, was feeling really good about it. And then I got a call on a Sunday from my boss saying, we want you to come into the office. And this was in the days before bosses called you on Sundays, which I hear is common now. And I just arrived at her office kind of bracing for the worst. And to my surprise, she told me, we want you to take over Cosmopolitan. I didn't even have a cell phone in those days. So it wasn't until I get home that I break the news to my husband. I said, you're not going to believe this. I'm the new editor of Cosmo. And he gets this big grin on his face. He goes, wait, I'm going to bed tonight. I think he thought I'd been handed the Kama Sutra and told bring the sutra here. Morning day. But as much as I love the idea of the job, I thought, I'm gonna have to get you this. There's no way you could have a side hustle with a job as big as Cosmo. But about 4 months later, over the Christmas holidays, I got out the 4 chapters and I discovered something I didn't remember writing. I had the nanny who was found dead in the first chapter, discovered on a copy of Cosmo. This is a sign from the universe, right? And I decided I'm gonna try to do it anyway. So I told myself, I'm just gonna write in the beginning for 15 minutes a day. And that's what I did. And 2.5 years later, If Looks Could Kill came out. And because it was a Kelly Ripa book club pick, it went to #1 on Amazon, became an instant New York Times bestseller. But I was in my late 40s. So that means that everybody here can do what I did. It doesn't matter what age you are. Though I give a dinner during Thriller Fest every year, and I had it Friday night, and the child comes and Karen Slaughter and Joe Fender, and there was one year when it's always the same group. I thought, not the oldest person here. The child is older than me. And I said, Lee, how old are you anyway? He goes, 68. I'm like, oh, okay, but still, he looks older than that. So there is still time no matter what you're in. So that's my story. Don't be discouraged. I used to go to author panels and people would say things that I found so discouraging, but it's almost like they didn't want you a member of the club they were in. So I just want to start with a lot of encouragement. So here are 10 strategies. I'll just go through them quickly. There's a lot to learn about writing thrillers and mysteries. And the #1 thing my agent says is that mistake that she sees people making who have done something else, and I assume most of you have, is that they think, well, I was successful as a lawyer, I was successful as a ER doctor, I was successful as an EMT. I can be successful at this. It's really a skill that you have to learn. And I will reference a few things in here about some of the things you have to learn, and I'm going to come into those in sort of a backward way, but I'm going to give you strategies that will really help, I promise you. The first one is suck information from the brains of other thriller and mystery authors. I called my talk, I described it as tips. I had sucked. I noticed they changed it.
Oh, I did?
I say it sucks like an alien from the minds of other thriller writers. But you have to do that too. And really what I'm saying is what my friend Karen Slaughter says, learn to read like a writer. It sounds so simplistic, but you all read thrillers and mysteries, right?
Yes.
And that's what's made you want to write them. You need to read, even go back and read some and see how they do what they do, and how they do what I'm going to tell you are some of the key points. And, use your Kindle, use the trade paperback you bought. My books make excellent tools for doing this, but you just want to mark it up and say, okay, that's where he or she did this, and this is where they did that. And it will become, in a way, a manual for you to use. Second tip, and if you have questions, maybe just make a little note of them so we don't interrupt and save plenty of time for questions. Be a plotter and a pantser. How many of you know what a pantser is? To explain to everyone, suspense authors are often divided into 2 camps, plotters and pantsers. Plotters plot out their books in advance. Pantsers go by the seat of their pants. I refuse to be a pantser because I hate that name. It sounds like you pull wedges on people. Lisa Unger, a really close friend of mine, is a diehard pantser. She will tell you, I start a book, I have no idea where it's going, and I let my characters take me. I don't think when you're first starting out, it is good to be a pantser. It's too easy to box yourself into a corner, and it's too easy not to hit some of the critical marks you have to hit in the thriller. I don't think you have to do a 30-page memo, the way Elizabeth George suggests in her book on writing. What I do is I sort of a combination plotter and pantser. I start out always knowing these key things. I know the inciting incident, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I know who my protagonist is, some of her vulnerabilities and her strengths and weaknesses, a little bit of her backstory. Now, some writers know all about her or him when they start. I learn more about her as I'm writing, and then I go back and fill in. I always know the killer. I know why he or she killed, and I always know what I'm going to make as my major plot twist at the end. These are the key parts of the thriller. The hook is also important, and I'll talk in a minute about how that's different than the inciting incident. I sometimes don't get my hook until after I've figured some of these other things out. The most important part of all of these, besides your character and how fleshed out she is, and I'll just talk about she for now, because I think most of you probably want to write about, well, maybe 2 or 3 guys, might want a male protagonist, but just for argument's sake, I'll talk about she. The most important of all of these, in some ways, is the inciting incident. That is the moment that ignites the plot, where everything explodes from that point. It usually occurs between 15–20% of the way into the book. And if you've got it much later, you're not going to have enticed your reader to stay with you. So this is another thing to be doing when you're going back over some of the books you've read. When did that inciting incident occur? The inciting incident, another way to describe it, is the hero's call to action. It is the moment the protagonist realizes there is a problem that she must deal with head on. And though she might resist at first, she eventually decides, I have to do this, and that will transform her. So not to, do too much spoiler alerting, Star Wars. In Star Wars, the inciting incident is the moment where Luke Skywalker finds his aunt and uncle dead, and he realizes, I'm sorry, I'm pulling out my bra strap, but I feel I can do that. He realizes that his aunt and uncle are dead, and he has to avenge their death. What if, well, we're still talking about plotting and pantsing. What if you say, hey, I've got a good inciting incident, but I don't have a full-fledged plot idea. I saw something in the paper today. I don't know if you noticed it. I think it was in the Times of the Washington Post. A funeral director was about to embalm a woman and found out she was still alive. So you could say, all right, that might be an exciting. For her, certainly. The trick that a lot of thriller authors use to help them with that little germ or the headline they see someplace is something called the what if trick. It sounds so simple, but I do it all the time. It helps your imagination go outside the line, color outside the lines. I'll just give you an example. A number of years ago, when my mom died, probably 7 years ago, we found out that she had left money in her will to a woman we'd never heard of. My brother Rick, who was the executor, says to me, did Mom have a daughter that we never knew about, that she didn't have the heart to tell us about? And it was my mom didn't leave a big estate, but she was a career woman. And so this was one of her IRAs and was fairly substantial. We felt kind of sick about the whole thing. Then it turns out, after one of my brothers says, that name one of my cousins had been married 4 times. She goes, I think that's Susan's third husband's name. So it turned out to be my cousin Susan. But why her? Well, in the end, it turned out to be a bank error.
Oh.
Her mother's name was similar. The bank refunded us the money. If you were a TD Bank customer, you paid for that mistake. They never clawed the money back. But I started doing what if with that. What if that happened to a character of mine? Her mother died and somebody else got left the money. What if she got left money and didn't know why? What if she got left money and she had no idea who the person was? So my book last year, Between Two Strangers, was about a woman who's left $3.5 million by a man she had a one-night stand with 12 years before. So I just kept doing what if, and it's a great tool to use if you feel like I've got my inciting incident, I've got something to play with. And as I said, it could be a news headline, it could be a conversation you've overheard, but what if will help you get there. Another thing that really helps you build an inciting incident out is research. You know, Harlan Coben once said to me, research is another form of procrastination. And to some degree, you know, guilty as charged, but so much of the time, research has led me to build out an inciting incident. I was doing a book a number of years ago where I just had the woman working at a fertility clinic. And when I read a book on fertility clinics and discovered a huge mind-blowing problem that had existed at one of them. And that began to give me where to go with an inciting incident. Number 3. Okay, so we've got our inciting incident, the hero's call to action. Come up with the biggest stakes imaginable and then make them even bigger. One of the mistakes, I just read somebody's novel they wanted me to take a look at on the way here, a friend of mine's daughter, and the stakes aren't high enough. So I'm digging a little deeper into the inciting incident right now. The reason the hero accepts the call to action is because the stakes are so high. Her life is in danger. Her child's life is in danger. When I was doing Between Two Strangers, I had originally thought maybe Skylar wants the $3.5 million so badly because she's going to help her sister with her hopes to have a baby. And then I realized not strong enough. So I made her the person who wanted to have a child more than anything and was going to have to use fertility treatment to do it. I saw something interesting. At one point, Kate Blanchett was talking about how when she was shooting the movie Tar, because they worked with a orchestra. Are you familiar with it? She plays a conductor. They're working with an orchestra in Berlin, and just because, or in Germany, someplace, because of the timing, they had to shoot that scene way early in the movie, almost before anything else. And she thought, wow, it's such an important scene. I hate doing it so out of sequence, but she said it made her see the stakes because as she's conducting this orchestra, she sees that for Tar, what she's going to lose is the thrill of that. Any of you read The Plot by Jean Horowitz? A fantastic thriller, really one of the best to look at. And in it, it's about a guy, Jake Bonner. He is teaching a writing class, and he's got this really arrogant guy who's a student of his who tells him, I've got a plot for a thriller. It is so brilliant. This book will make so much money. And he tells the teacher what it is, and the teacher is sick because he's a guy who's trying to be successful as a thriller writer and not having any luck, and it is brilliant. Well, a few years later, the guy's never published it, and he finds out he's dead. So he steals the plot. And then one day, all right, here's an inciting incident for you with so much at stake. In a few short years, all of Evan Parker, he was the dead author, predictions have come true. And he didn't steal the book, he just stole the idea. But Jake is the author enjoying the way. He is wealthy, famous, praised, and read all over the world. But at the height of his glorious new life, an email arrives, the first salvo in a terrifying anonymous campaign. You are a thief. Okay, terrifying. And look what's at stake. Everything for him, his life, his reputation, his money, everything. And just one last thing about trying to let things explode from your inciting incident, because what needs to happen there is your hero sets out trying to deal with this situation. Maybe someone's stolen her daughter or is threatening something. You have to have her keep coming up against hurdle after hurdle. That's what comes after the inciting incident. And there are really good books that can help you sort of figure out how the arc of this has to go. One of my favorites is called, and you may have heard of it, Save the Cat Writes a Novel.
That's a good one.
It's a really great book that helps you with the arc. But I heard a writer say at Thriller Fest, keep in mind the question in your book. What is that question? A lot of times it's, who's the killer? But from there, other questions unfold. And that can be kind of a through line that helps you keep the tension going. You want plenty of fear from that inciting incident. You know what else you want? You want dread. Dread is a very powerful feeling, and that's often missing in thrillers. Gillian Flynn, who has been at that famous dinner at my apartment, she said, I love this line, dread is probably my favorite emotion. I don't necessarily love being the cat jumping out of the cabinet scared, but I love that slow boiled dread of something's wrong here. That's a question. What is wrong? I don't know what it is. What is it? So once you've got your inciting incident, you're just going to have to come up with all those hurdles as your protagonist tries to get to the bottom of it and solve the problem. Number 4, and I'll go more quickly through the rest. Spend a zillion hours on your first page, your first chapter, and especially your first sentence. This is where the hook of the book happens. Not the inciting incident. The hook gets you into the book. The hook is often the first line, or it could be the setup. In Star Wars, the hook R2D2 and what's his name arriving on the planet, and you're just curious. None of us had ever seen a movie like Star Wars, so right away we love this. And then we find out there's help me Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan your only hope. We're hooked. What is this? Not the inciting incident, though. The inciting incident is that when he comes back from that and discovers his aunt and uncle are dead. So if you can get both a powerful hook and a powerful inciting incident, you've got the double whammy. More and more, you need to let that kind of hook happen on that first page. The first sentence. I saw Pamela's agents at Thriller Fest because a friend of mine is an agent was on it. They were saying when they're looking at submissions that come in, they are often reading just the first page. So it's not just your reader you want to entice, it's the freaking agent. Some great ones, great first lines. Rebecca. Last night I dreamed, let's hear it. I went to Anderlecht again, right? We know that we love it. If we were seduced from that first line. Gone Girl. When I think of my wife, I always think of her hands. I want to keep going when I see that. Verity. Any Verity readers here? Okay. I hear the crack of his skull before the spattering of blood reaches me. How do you not keep going, right? So even though I don't want you to really spend a zillion hours on the first page, buff it and buff it and buff it, keep writing, go back with what you've been working on and buff it again, buff it some more. Is this seductive enough? There was a lot of buzz a number of months ago. Gillian Flynn was interviewed by Chicago Magazine, and she admitted she's, working on her next book. And she said, it's the greatest first page that's ever been written. But hey, she knows it's gotta be the greatest first page ever written. Number 5. Okay, so we've got our hook, we've got our inciting incident, we're into that, first part of the book. The inciting incidents happening, within the first 15 to 20% of the book. But now you're really building scenes. You're helping your character get from the hook to the inciting incident, and then through all those hurdles until she solves the problem and is transformed. Memorize the 7 words that will help you write killer scenes. These 2 little tips help me all the time, even today. One I learned from Joe Pinder. Have any of you ever read him? He wrote a book called Paranoia. His first book was a huge bestseller. And it was so funny because it was about a career woman. I know Joe very well. He was at the dinner the other night, but my son read it before me, Paranoia, and he goes, Mom, he mentions your book in it because she's a career woman. And years ago, I wrote a book called Why Good Girls Won't Get Ahead. And the bad guy notices it in the girl's apartment. So I thought that was one cool thing. Joe told me once that he keeps a Post-it on his computer with 3 words that he feels he needs to think about when he writes every single scene. They are surprise, reveal, and reversal. Your scenes can't just sit there. They can't just be about your protagonist having coffee with somebody else. They have to advance the plot. And what Joe says is that every scene needs at least one of those. So you ask yourself, is something being revealed here? Is there a surprise, a discovery that's made, the weapons discovered, somebody wasn't where they were supposed to be, your protagonist finds out, or is there a reversal? And there've got to be reversals for your main character through the book. The other 4 words that really help me with scene building have to do with dialogue. And they come from a wonderful book about writing by Charles Johnson, who wrote that brilliant book, Middle Passage, about the North Atlantic slave trade. He gives a great little strategy for dialogue. The 4 words: entrance, rhythm, hit, and exit. Again, your dialogue can't just sit there. It's got to have movement, momentum. Thrillers really ultimately are all about movement. It's your character's race against the clock to solve the problem. So entrance is, you're setting up the dialogue scene real quick. Rhythm, they hit their stride. The hit is where the agenda is revealed, because as he would say, everyone comes to a dialogue situation, a thriller, with some sort of an agenda. And then the exit is when they part and something has been transformed a little bit from that. Information has been revealed, or one character may suspect something based on what the other person said. Or you're gonna like number 6. Reread 2 Nancy Drew books. One of the things people often say about me, whether it's an Amazon review or whatever, is, wow, you have great chapter endings. I wanted to stop. It was midnight. I wanted to stop, but I got to that chapter ending and I kept going. And that's what we all want with readers to have. So not just thinking about your scenes, but ultimately you're thinking about your chapters. And you want the chapter to have movement and you want the reader to want to keep going. And what helped me was rereading Nancy Drew. I just jotted down, I can't remember, it might have been from, it wasn't from my favorite, The Secret of Redgate Farm, but it's from one. As they ate, Helen said, Aunt Rosemary hasn't told you half the things that happened. Once Miss Flora thought she saw someone sliding out of the fireplace at midnight. Maybe the clue in the old fireplace was like, and another little chair moved from one side of the room to the other while her back was turned, but no one was there. How extraordinary, Hannah Gruen exclaimed. I've often heard about such things, but I never thought I'd meet anyone who lived in a haunted house. Helen turned to Nancy and gazed pleadingly at her friend. You see how much you're needed at Twin Elms? Won't you please go there with me and solve the mystery of the ghost? Don't you want to keep going? So I found it helpful to reread some Nancy Drew books. Don't laugh, it worked. Number 7. Think like a magician. I mentioned earlier, one of the key things you have to come up with any thriller is your twist. The big reveal at the end, where maybe the cop is really the killer, whatever it's going to be. You need to, I think, know in advance, because that allows you to lay down red herrings, the false clues, and your clues. You want to create a lot of misdirection in your book. And one of the things that helped me was actually reading a couple of books on magic. Misdirection is sometimes defined as the intentional deflection of attention for the purpose of disguise. It would encompass anything that prevents you from noticing the secret method, the technique used to bring about the observed effect. What a friend of mine who, her wife was a magician, a top magician in New York, she let me interview her. And she said that the magician has often finished the trick while he or she is announcing they're doing it. And you've been distracted by what they're doing. And you want to find little ways in your book to distract your reader, to misdirect us. Well, one time I had this character in the book, and I like to have 4 or 5 suspects, and then I like to have a rogue suspect or two. Somebody that isn't a major suspect, but maybe the reader will think, but what about her? So once I had the protagonist walk into a room, and this character ended her phone call fairly quickly, which is a normal thing you might do when someone enters the room, but I knew the reader would go, why did she answer the call so quickly? And so many people said to me later, I thought it was so-and-so, just because of that one little trick. Sometimes it's like, I did a book once where I made sure that one of the good characters, not the protagonist, had a lot of information at her disposal, because I wanted the reader to think, is that too much information? Why does she know so much? Is she involved in some other level? So start thinking about misdirection. Ultimately, you want your big twist to happen organically. I don't know about you, but I just felt there have been so many books lately where the big twist is like, oh my God. You know, there was one book I read where it was like 2 serial killers at the end. I'm like, there just aren't that many in the US. I feel that's viable. But when you really try to have it happen organically, it leaves the reader with a sense of satisfaction without doing any kind of terrible spoiler. I want to tell you one of my the twists in one of my favorite books. It's quite old, but I loved it. Police officer goes to the home of a family. 4 people have been shot. The grandmother is lying dead at the dining room table. So is her daughter. Her granddaughter has been seriously injured. And upstairs, coming from downstairs, as if perhaps answering a phone call, is the grandfather. when the young woman who's been shot comes to, she is beyond distraught. They're trying to figure out who is the killer. And it turns out to be the granddaughter's boyfriend. Because the granddaughter felt just suffocated by this family. Here she's still living with her mother and grandfather and grandmother. And the reason she's distraught is because the boyfriend wasn't supposed to shoot her too. He didn't shoot to kill her, but he began to realize as he was doing it, this is not going to look good. They're going to figure it out. So the detective is all the time confused, and he's so brilliant, he figures it out in the end by how distraught she is. But it's such an organic thing. Yes, you get it. She was living, she was living with her mother and grandmother, and the more he finds out about it personally, the more you realize she was just feeling incredibly frustrated and entitled, and it wasn't working for her. It wasn't over the top crazy. So the more organic you can make it, the more real it's going to be. Okay, just a couple more. 8, edit your first draft with one key question in mind. Chris Pavoni, do you know him? He wrote that brilliant book, 2 Nights in Lisbon. He's part of the dinner group too. He interviewed me at a Barnes and Noble in New York the other night, and he told this really interesting story. He said he had been raising his kids while his wife had a big job in Luxembourg, and he knew he wasn't going to be able to get a job there himself. So he started writing an international thriller. And he had worked in the book business. He sends it to a top editor. He gets a call. The editor liked to take him to lunch. He's thinking, whoa, okay, this is it, right? They don't take you to lunch if they don't mean business. They chat the whole lunch, and the editor never says something. He realizes it's going to happen over coffee. Finally, the editor says, I liked your book, but not enough happens. And Chris says he reads every first draft with that question in mind. Is enough happening? And I will tell you that first draft you write, enough won't be happening. So he says when he goes back, he uses that question to help him add twists, to add more reversals, to add more reveals, and just load it on. You want your reader to be constantly surprised. You want that momentum. I saw a woman say on Instagram the other day, a bookstagrammer asked, what's the definition of a great thriller to you? And she said, if I'm not asking what the F every 3 chapters on the long book, or else is what they're expecting these days. Part of when you're going back and asking if there's enough happening, this is when you start to cut. Get rid of the stuff where nothing is happening. Number 9, remember it all comes back to character. Earlier I said you want to figure out your protagonist. You want her vulnerabilities, his vulnerabilities, what makes them a person, what's their backstory. Create a backstory that you don't even reveal all of it. Sometimes it's interesting to give your protagonist a secret that you never even get into discussing, just something you know about her. Flesh her out, flesh him out. And then that also helps you with those twists to make them organic. Because what you want is the twist to make sense based on the character. Just a quick little story. My husband and I live in Uruguay in the winter for 4 months. It's one of the reasons I wanted to leave my job at Cosmopolitan and become a full-time author. And one day I went to use the deodorant. And I said, honey, where's the deodorant? It's not here. He goes, Kater, I'm not letting you use it anymore. You glom it up, you don't use it right. You can't use it anymore. I said, you're crazy. He goes, no, you cannot use my deodorant anymore. So I thought, well, that's what he thinks. I'm going to find the deodorant. I looked all over for it. I looked in the cabinets. I looked in the closet. I looked at his home office. I didn't find it. Then a couple weeks later, we have a bowl on top of the cabinet in the bathroom, and I was reaching behind the bowl because I dropped my toothbrush, and there's the owner. I realized my husband is one of the most expedient people I know. That is his character. He would have never hid it down the hall. So if I were thinking about him, you know, and who he is, and I was making him the murderer, I would think about expediency. It wouldn't be a 3-month plot to kill me off. It would be very quick and, very easily. So keep coming back to character. What makes your character fit? And lastly, number 10, before I take some questions, write every day. I know that's hard, isn't it? Why do I say that? That's because that's what John Grisham says. He said in a great piece in the New York Times, you have to write every day. And it's not just because that's what you're supposed to do, but if, Charles Darwin spent some time in Uruguay, and I just wrote this, I love, he said in a letter to a friend, he was laying out the scaffolding of what would later become the primordial soup theory. And he said, basically, Earth's original blend of gases produced a broth of organic molecules when exposed to light and heat, eventually forming the building blocks of life in amino acids. But to me, when you are writing, you are doing that primordial soup. And if you leave that soup unattended, your characters are talking to you in the shower, you're not coming up with twist idea. It doesn't have to be long every day. In the beginning, I swear, 15 minutes a day was all I did. And over time, as I got used to it, I added on and on and on. So if John Grisham says we should do it, I'm all for it. So those are 10 kind of wacky things that I feel help me. As Pam says, I've written 18 suspense novels. I just handed in the 19th, which was really fun to do because I had to open up a few chapters in Uruguay. And so I would love to answer any questions now that you might have. And you can say a friend of mine who's writing a novel. I've given you some time to think of your questions by talking all this through. So you've got to have them. What are they? Yes.
How do you go about building character? Do you have like an outline of all of the things that you want to know about them, or like how do you go about doing that?
That's a great question. I didn't really include a lot on that process because it differs for everybody. I always start with some little nugget of myself. I just feel like with one character, I made her a little curmudgeon-y, and I have that side. With Bailey Waggins, who's in the 8 Bailey Waggins mysteries, she is very irreverent. She adjusts her bra strap in public, that kind of person. And that was easy for me because that's sort of my alter ego. But I don't have the character fully formed when I start. Now, that's not true of everyone, but I find the more I start and have incidents where she has to react to them, then I start thinking, well, why does she react this way? What could have happened in her past that would make her choose totally that sense? But a lot of people talk about just doing a 2-page bio. And you can include things like what she liked to read in first grade. It doesn't have to come in the book, but that could start to give you a sense of who. And, I also think it doesn't hurt to look at the marketplace. Lee once told me that part of why he made Reacher a loner was he looked at what was out there selling and he felt there were enough books about people who were part of a team or whatever. He thought, hey, there's room now for a loner. So don't be afraid of that. Yes.
Where do you end it where you can walk away from the character and say, I think I have him or her, and now let me go back to the story? Because you did say, then you went back.
Right.
And did a
Well,
lot more
I'm
tweaking.
writing the whole time. So what I like to do is I said that I'm a plotter and a pantser. I get my basic plot and then I always have a spiral notebook. And I then plot out more carefully 4 chapters at a time. And I often go to little cafes in New York sometimes with a glass of wine, and I will then do those 4 chapters, but I also ask myself a lot of questions. Years ago, there was a woman who wrote a book called Practical Intuition, who we interviewed her for a magazine I was working at, and she said something that Twyla Tharp, I heard say later. When you have a question, like a question about your character, put it to the universe. And it's not like some woo-woo thing happens, but you happen to see something like, you see this and you think, God, well, maybe she killed him with garden shears. It opens your subconscious to receiving information. So I do that not only with the plot, but with the character. Why would she do that? What happened to her once that would make her do that? What is her motivation for that? Sometimes it has to do with her being a mother or parent, not so much in my books, but I know with Lisa Umber's book, she really relies on that.
Great, 2 more questions. I think did you have a question?
Yeah.
I could see being interested in writing a mystery, and so many of them have to do with, for example, murdering someone, killing someone, and involves usually police, which I know nothing about either one of those. So, you talked about research, but if that's not where you're coming from, how do you make that genuine?
Well, that's such a good question. I'm a big researcher. I think there are a lot of books out there, like I think The Other Mrs. Parrish, and now the sisters have a new one coming out that don't necessarily always involve a dead body. But what I did many, many years ago, I would interview cops in New York. Now they don't really have you do it. So some of my best sources are cops from smaller towns that I just approach and help me. But about 20 years ago, I was interviewing a New York City cop, and I said, God, I don't know anything about forensics. And he said, you ought to talk to Barbara Butcher. She was a death scene investigator in New York.
Yeah.
I've interviewed her for all 19 books. She's become one of my closest friends over all these years. I introduced her to my agent, told her she needed to write a book called Let the Dead Know. It came out last year. It's been a huge success. And she was the star of that Homicide New York series on Netflix, and more in the works. And now I can just call her up. We have lunch. I can just say, slash across the neck, how much would take her to leave out. She has come with me to certain locations and helped me figure things out. People like helping. So I would say 2 things. Think about Nancy never had a dead body. No one ever died in the Nancy Drew book. We just sort of remember them dying, but they didn't. Think about, maybe it's just a psychological drama where the woman is gaslighted and ends up going to this insane asylum because she outsmarts her gaslighter. Doesn't have to necessarily have police. And then start small, and people are usually very willing to help you and give you information.
Great. We actually have something here.
Oh, okay.
More questions.
Okay.
All right, 2 more. This person here, and then you.
I was just wondering, do you have any sort of advice for people who are writing maybe literary fiction or interested in writing literature? I'm serving an MFA in fiction at Columbia, and I'm interested in writing that, and I was hoping maybe you could get some wisdom, or some adjustments to some of the if they're.
Yeah, I think a lot of those things have to happen there too. Certainly there are just tons of wonderful literary fiction where they don't follow the rules so carefully. I don't know if you ever read Asymmetry. Do you know that book? It's such a brilliant book. It's by by an author who had an affair with Philip Roth when he was very young and he was very old. And it starts and then it just goes off in a whole other direction. But take something like Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes, great literary fiction. So much literary fiction. Tom Lake, by Anne Patton, it has a mystery at the heart of it. So still, there's got to be that call to action. the protagonist has to have something that happens that leads them down a path, solving the mystery of the mystery of their family. And so I think a lot of those rules apply. Another book that I would recommend is the Stephen King book on writing. It's just wonderful. It really gives some great ideas there. But I think you would find that a lot of what works in that I talked about is important there too. You're not going to keep reading a literary fiction if the scenes don't move.
Great, our last question.
It's a fun one.
Yeah.
So now that you've written books that are a series like the Bailey Wiggins and then standalones, is it easier for you to write a Bailey Wiggins book because now you're not creating a new character? You're not, we know her, we love her, like I love her, and the fact that you're having another one, it's like just like Stuart Wood with Stone Barrington, if anybody's ever read any of those, he's like kind of passed away, but now somebody's taking it over. But it's like, I have to have Stone Barrington. I have to have the Bailey Wiggins book because they're like your friends and you want to know that. So as a writer, is it easier for you to say, oh, I've already written about Bailey. Everybody already has a picture in their head of what she looks like and who she is. Does it make it faster for you to write it than creating a whole new character and a whole new scenario?
To some degree, because you're just starting a new Bailey. I missed her, and I really love kind of having her in the shower with me in the morning. But when you do a series, hopefully there's a character arc going on. She, over the course of those books, changes, grows, has reflections, has setbacks. And that is something that you have to bring to each book. How has that arc happened, manifest itself in this book too?
And time has passed or something.
Time has passed, that's right, that's right. Yeah, she didn't even have a cell phone. She had a BlackBerry early on, and so like, wow, what was that? Thank you so much for coming. There's a great website, Jane Friedman. If you want information about getting an agent, information about publishing, one of her long blogs on it is how to get published. So I would definitely look at that. Definitely buy Save the Cat Writes a Novel. That will help you tremendously. And that will even help with literary fiction because she mentioned some literary fiction in it.
Thank you so much.